Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 6 on Henry and his ministers. Well, in the previous video, ladies and gentlemen, we were looking at Cardinal Wolsey and his domestic reforms, what they were and how successful they were. And I said to you there was one particular reform that was so important it needed its own video, and here it is. And the reform that we're going to examine was called the Amicable Grant. Now, you could say that those two words were in fact badly named. Let's see what we mean by that. It was one of Wolsey's most important reforms because it was looking and linking domestic issues, basically finance, to Henry VIII's foreign plans and Henry VIII's foreign policy, called the Amicable Grant. What was it? Well, in its simplest terms, of course, it was a tax, a new tax, 1625. And the reason for it, very simple, it was a tax raised to help pay for Henry's plans to invade France. It was about war, ladies and gentlemen. Henry and fighting over in France. Now, here's a little bit of background first. There's more on Henry VIII's foreign policy coming in the next few videos, but just a very quick introduction for you. Europe at that time, there were three main key players. There was Francis I, King of France. There was Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And there was Henry VIII, King of England. So there's three main men, three kings. As we say in our old Christmas carol, we three kings of Orient are. Well, it wasn't the Orient over in the east. It was we three kings in Europe are, the three main men. Francis, Charles and Henry. We'll do more about them later. But just a short overview so that we can understand the Amicable Grant. Excuse me. In 1525, Emperor Charles V had a big win in his battles against France. He'd actually captured King Francis. Henry now saw an opportunity, a chance to win back some of the land that England had lost in France. But if he's going to do that, of course, he needs money, because as we know, as I've said before, war is very expensive. So Wolsey intervened. Wolsey decided to introduce a new tax, the Amicable Grant, to pay for the invasion. Because you've got to have money to pay for the weapons, the ships, the food, the supplies, the soldiers, the wages. War was expensive. So Wolsey said, our new tax, this Amicable Grant, will pay for the invasion. Why was new money needed? If you looked at my previous video, I'd shown you that Wolsey had actually raised quite a lot of money in forced loans, in subsidies. He had raised a huge amount of money for Henry VIII. But, ladies and gentlemen, Henry VIII had spent most of that money largely on a failed invasion in France in 1523, 2 years before. So now Wolsey needed extra money. He needed an extra way of raising taxation. And he came up with the Amicable Grant. Wolsey was taking a risk with this new tax. Why? Well, let's have a look at the two words. Amicable, grant. What does amicable mean? Well, in its simplest form, it means friendly. Grant, of course, is a gift. So Wolsey was saying, look, it's just a friendly gift that you are going to make to Henry VIII. That's the way Wolsey was trying to present it to the country. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, other people in the country did not see it like that. They did not agree with Wolsey. They're saying, hang on a minute, you want me voluntarily, friendly, if you like, just to give away money to the king? Yes, says Wolsey, an amicable grant. There was going to be problems. There may be trouble ahead. Well, there would be, for Wolsey. Why? Why would there be so many problems for Wolsey with this new reform, the Amicable Grant? Well, first of all, it had emerged, it was a tradition going back centuries, that Parliament was involved in taxation. Parliament would be involved in the process. The old method of the tenths and the 15ths that I mentioned in the previous video, they were all done with Parliament's approval. Not so with the Amicable Grant, ladies and gentlemen. Instead, this was going to be introduced by royal decree. In other words, Wolsey was not asking Parliament. That was a big change, and it proved to be troublesome. There was no consultation. Therefore, the Amicable Grant increased resentment, and with it the risk of rebellion against Henry. Potentially troublesome. The second main problem with the Amicable Grant was time. What's the time? How long do I have to get this money that I'm going to give away in a friendly way? 10 weeks. So it was quite a short time to prepare. If it's an extra tax that you didn't think you'd have to pay and you've got to pay it in 10 weeks, this is going to cause trouble. So that's the second problem with the Amicable Grant. And the third was the amount that you had to pay. According to Wolsey's new tax, the Amicable Grant, priests would have to pay 1/3 of their property, and everyone else would have to pay 1/6. Well, just remember, normally they're used to paying 1/10 or 1/15. Now they have to pay far more, and they have to pay it more quickly, and they haven't had the permission of Parliament. So if you put those three things together, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see that the Amicable Grant was not amicable. It was being forced upon people, and people were not happy. Wolsey's reform was in trouble. Well, what were the results? Well, Wolsey, very efficient, very hard-working, he sent out commissioners across the country to collect it. But this only increased the anger. Many refused to pay. Many said, look, we can't possibly afford it, not in this short time scale, and it's too much. We've already paid for other things. Remember the forced loans and the subsidies? And now you want this extra. No, they were becoming angry. A place called Lavenham in Suffolk, there was a full-scale rebellion. Up to 10,000 people gathered in a huge crowd. Now, they're loyal to the crown. They're not against Henry VIII, but they are against his minister and this new Amicable Grant. It was so serious that two of the top dukes in the country, the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk, they were sent out to Suffolk to crush the rebellion. Well, there was no fighting. Let's put the weapons down. There was no fighting. When the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk got there and met the crowd, they actually agreed with a lot of the protests. They thought, maybe it isn't fair, and also they might not have liked Wolsey. The rebels surrendered without a fight. Later they were pardoned, they were let off, but the tax was abandoned. Wolsey's not getting his money to give to King Henry. So therefore Henry postponed the invasion plans and instead made peace with France. They were the short-term consequences, if you like, of the Amicable Grant. But it was so important that you could argue there were long-term consequences as well. And mainly, it wasn't damage to Henry VIII, even though he would have benefited and he had to change his plans to invade France. No, it wasn't Henry who was damaged. Remember the 10,000 crowd at Lavenham? They were loyal to Henry. They were against Wolsey. It was Wolsey who suffered most from the fallout of the Amicable Grant. He had to take the blame for the tax, not King Henry. In a way, it was his first humiliation. His reputation had been badly damaged. Up to this, normally, whatever Wolsey did, he did successfully. He did effectively. After this, no, Wolsey cannot raise any more tax. Possibly for the first time, King Henry VIII begins to doubt, begins to query the judgment and the effectiveness of his chief minister, Wolsey. Before then, they were very close together. Remember, Wolsey, Alter Rex, the second king. It's as if King Henry and Wolsey were a really good team, closely bonded, because Wolsey was doing exactly what Henry required. Maybe this was the first sign of them splitting, dividing, and Henry thinking, he didn't do well for me there. And of course, eventually Wolsey fell from power. Was this the first step towards that? Have a think. Now, if Wolsey's finally pulling away from Henry, or Henry's pulling away from Wolsey, that will strengthen Wolsey's enemies at court. Now, Wolsey was aware of this, and he tries to limit their power. Think back to the previous video and the Eltham ordinances, where he tries to reduce the numbers in the Privy Chamber, trying to talk to Henry VIII. So, the Amicable Grant did change the relationship between Henry and Wolsey. One other thing that it did, the failure showed even the power of King Henry. He couldn't do just anything he wanted. There were some limits. It's underlined yet again the clear link between parliamentary consent and raising taxation. So, that's Wolsey's final reform domestically, the Amicable Grant. But I've hinted in this video, although it was very much based here in England and it was a domestic reform, the purpose of it was linked to the foreign policy. He wanted the money for Henry VIII's planned invasion of France. So that leads us nicely onto Henry VIII and his foreign policy. And that's what we'll have a look at, starting in the next video. As ever, ladies and gentlemen, I hope it's been useful. As ever, I'll see you soon with the next video. Till then, all the best now. Take care.